In 1324, Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca was so financially catastrophic for the Middle East that historians estimate his generosity caused 12 years of gold market inflation across Egypt, Arabia, and parts of Europe. His personal wealth, adjusted for today's value, is estimated between $400 billion and $415 billion, making him the wealthiest individual in Africa history. His empire lasted less than 2 generations after his death. Aliko Dangote's net worth sits at approximately $38 to $50 billion. His refinery processes more crude oil per day than most African nations produce annually. His cement operations span 14 countries. His refinery processes 650,000 barrels of crude oil per day. His fertilizer capacity could reshape the agricultural economics of an entire continent. He is building something Mansa Musa never built. By the end of this video, you will see the one structural mistake that destroyed the Mali Empire and understand exactly why Dangote is racing against time to avoid repeating it. Every empire in history, without exception, was built on the same foundational principle: control over something the world cannot function without. Mansa Musa did not become the wealthiest in history by being the smartest man in the room. He became the wealthiest because he sat at the geographic center of the two commodities that made the medieval global economy run: gold and salt. In the 14th century, gold was not just currency, it was the currency. Every transaction between the major powers of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa was ultimately denominated in gold. And at the peak of Mali's power, the empire produced approximately half of the world's entire gold supply. Salt was equally non-negotiable. Salt was the only reliable food preservation technology that existed. Before any modern preservation method, salt was the difference between a civilization that could store food and one that could not. Saharan salt mines controlled by Mali were not a commodity play. They were a survival infrastructure. Mansa Musa did not choose these industries because they were profitable. He inherited and then defended control of them because they were unavoidable. The world had no choice but to engage with Mali on Mali's terms because the world could not function without what Mali controlled. Now, look at Dangote's portfolio without the brand name attached: sugar, salt, flour, fertilizer, petroleum, cement. You cannot feed a population without sugar, salt, and flour. You cannot grow the food that feeds the people without fertilizer. You cannot move goods, power vehicles, or run industry without petroleum. You cannot build a house without cement. These are not products that require marketing. They are daily life non-negotiables, in exactly the same way gold and salt were in the 14th century. When Dangote entered the cement market in Nigeria in the 1990s, Nigeria was importing cement while sitting on the raw limestone required to produce it domestically. He did not invent a new product. He identified a structural dependency and positioned himself at the point where that dependency was most exposed. Obayana Cement Plant in Kogi State, commissioned in 2003, became the largest cement plant in sub-Saharan Africa, with a capacity of 13.25 million metric tons per year. The Dangote cement portfolio now spans 14 African countries with a total production capacity of 51.6 million metric tons annually. The lesson in both cases is identical. You do not build a lasting empire by selling what people want. You build it by owning what they cannot live without. Wants are negotiable. Needs are not. The moment you control a necessity, the pricing conversation shifts permanently in your favor. Here is something most business analysis misses about both of these men. At a certain scale of wealth, money stops being the primary weapon. It becomes the background. What moves in front of it is something harder to quantify and infinitely harder to replicate. Perception of inevitability. In 1324, Mansa Musa did not need to travel to Mecca. He was already the most powerful ruler in West Africa. His trade routes were secure. His treasury was full. There was no strategic necessity compelling him to make a 4,000-mile pilgrimage with 60,000 to 80,000 people and so much gold that he literally broke foreign economies by spending it. He went because he understood something that most rulers of his era did not. Military power protects you within your borders. Demonstrated wealth on a global stage protects you from the people who have never seen your borders, because it changes their calculation about whether the cost of challenging you is even worth considering. Dangote has run the same operation at a continental scale. He is not just a Nigerian businessman. He has deliberately and systematically positioned himself as an African industrialist, a distinction that carries specific strategic weight. Every press conference about the refinery is framed around African energy independence. Every cement plant opening in a new country is framed around African construction capacity. Every fertilizer facility is framed around African food sovereignty. This is not PR. This is brand as political shield. When the Nigerian government considers a policy that would damage Dangote's operations, it has to calculate what that signal sends to every foreign observer watching how the Africa's most recognized industrialist is treated on his own continent. When a foreign competitor considers an aggressive move against his market position, it has to consider the continental political relationships his brand has built. In October 2023, when the Dangote Refinery announced it would begin exporting petroleum products to other African nations, it was not just a business development announcement, it was a positioning statement. This refinery is not a Nigerian asset, it is an African one, and that framing makes it politically much harder to attack. Mansa Musa built brand by spending gold across the known world. Dangote is building brand by processing petroleum for it. Both understood the same truth. At a certain scale of wealth, your balance sheet is only as protected as your reputation makes it. Stop here, because this is the part that matters most. Everything you have heard so far is impressive. The monopoly logic is sound. The soft power strategy is sophisticated. The parallel between these two men across 7 centuries is real and documentable, and more precise than most people realize.
But Mansa Musa's empire is gone. The Mali Empire that produced half the world's gold and controlled the Saharan trade routes that fed the medieval global economy collapsed within 2 generations of its greatest ruler's death. The Songhai Empire absorbed it. And the structural reason it happened is the most important business lesson the 14th century produced. Mansa Musa's wealth was not a system, it was a person operating inside favorable conditions. The gold existed before him, the salt mines existed before him, the trade routes existed before him. What he provided was the military dominance to control all 3 simultaneously, and the political intelligence to leverage that control into global recognition.
But the mechanism for maintaining that control, continuous military superiority over the Saharan trade network, required a specific quality of leadership that his successors could not consistently provide. When Mansa Musa died in approximately 1337, succession disputes immediately fractured the political unity that had made coordinated control of the trade routes possible. Within decades, the Songhai were pressing from the east, the Tuareg were raiding from the north, the gold routes were no longer fully under Mali's control, and a monopoly that is not fully controlled is not a monopoly, it is a market position, and market positions can be competed away. This is precisely what most African businesses do. They build around a person who holds the relationships, makes the decisions, carries the institutional knowledge, and maintains the political connections. The business functions brilliantly while that person is functioning brilliantly, and the moment they are not, through death, illness, or distraction, the whole structure becomes visible for what it always was. This is where most African businesses fail. Not in the early years, not when capital is scarce and competition is everywhere and the whole enterprise feels precarious. They fail at the peak, when the founder is at the height of their power and the business is at the height of its performance. That is precisely when the structural weakness is most invisible and most dangerous, because nobody is looking for what could go wrong when everything is going right. Mansa Musa was at his peak in 1324. As a result of that, the empire was at its territorial maximum, and the wealth was at its historic high. Then, the succession architecture that would determine whether any of it survived him was almost certainly the last thing anyone was focused on. Sound familiar? Here is what Dangote has done differently, and here is where the comparison becomes genuinely instructive rather than just intellectually interesting. Dangote Group is structured as a corporate entity, not a personal holding. That distinction sounds administrative. It is existential. A corporate entity has governance structures, board oversight, documented processes, and legal infrastructure that exists independently of any single individual's continued participation. When Dangote walks into a boardroom, he walks in as the dominant shareholder and executive chairman, but the company's operational capacity does not live exclusively in his brain. It lives in systems, in documented procedures, in an organizational structure with functional leadership across each business unit that does not reset to zero the moment he is no longer in the room. This is the Dangote Foundation, Dangote Industries Limited as the holding company, Dangote Cement listed publicly on the Nigerian Stock Exchange, which means its governance obligations extend beyond what its founder decides and into what public market regulation requires. The refinery structured as a separate entity with its own board and its own institutional investors. Each of these structures is a layer of institutional independence that did not exist in the Mali Empire. Mansa Musa's wealth was his decisions were final. His death, therefore, the company's death. Dangote's wealth is substantially his, but the structures around it are designed to outlast him. A publicly listed company does not die when its founder does. It restructures, it appoints new leadership, it continues generating revenue because the physical assets, the cement plants, the refinery, the fertilizer facilities, continue operating regardless of who signs the checks. The physical infrastructure is the succession plan in a way that Mansa Musa's trade route control never was. You can lose a trade route to a stronger army. You cannot lose a refinery the same way, because it is embedded in the supply chain of an entire continent in ways that make it structurally resistant to the kind of sudden destabilization that dismantled Mali's empire within decades. But, and this is the part that does not appear in the press releases, The succession problem is not fully solved. Dangote is 67 years old. There is no publicly named successor. The Dangote Group's operational coherence still runs substantially through one man's judgment, relationships, and decision-making authority. The corporate structures exist. The institutional framework is more sophisticated than anything Mansa Musa built. But the human question, who runs this after him, and do they have the relational capital, the political intelligence, and the strategic judgment to maintain what he built, remains publicly unanswered. Mansa Musa knew he was the most powerful man in Africa. He almost certainly did not know he was also the most critical single point of failure in the most important empire on the continent. Dangote knows both of those things. The question history will answer, the one this video cannot answer for you, is whether knowing the mistake is enough to avoid repeating it. Monuments erode, systems compound. The Mali Empire at its peak was worth more in real terms than any single corporate entity alive today. It employed more people, controlled more of the world's critical resources, and commanded more geopolitical respect than most modern nations. None of that survived the man who built it. The question every business builder on this continent needs to sit with is not how to accumulate more. It is how to build something that does not require you to be present for it to keep running. Mansa Musa answered that question too late. Dangote is answering it in real time, under the scrutiny of global markets, with the largest industrial project in African history as the evidence of his answer. 700 years from now, someone will look back at this period of African economic history and ask the same question we are asking about Mansa Musa today. Did he build a monument, or did he build a system? We'll find out together.